It is surely worth asking whether Dante actually went to paradise, as he says he did in the Divine Comedy, and as he is repeatedly keen to tell us that he did as well. He is, after all, writing a comedy. He wants to bring us from a place of misery to a place of happiness. And if the way that he was proposing to do that was some kind of artifice, then you might well be right in feeling disappointed, if not a bit angry. I think it's also worth asking whether it's true because he very self consciously wrote for not just his times but our times. He knew, I think, that in the modern period, a word that he uses for the first time in Italian, people were becoming uncoupled from spiritual reality, that a meaning crisis was already upon people in the 14th century. And so he wants to address that. And you see that even more now, where, well, engaging with the Divine Comedy, people often are quite happy to talk about hell. They can sort of appreciate how there are hellish states of mind, and so the Inferno makes sense. Maybe they can relate to the Purgatory too. It's about change, it feels a bit therapeutic. That makes some sense. But people often say the paradise is difficult, as in fact Dante did, because it's about the transformation of our perceptions if we're to see and experience and so directly know this place. It's also, I think, worth pushing back against the strong tendency, particularly in the academic study of Dante, to use literary or critical techniques to explain it, which explain it away. I've no doubt somebody has already written a book on Dante and neuroscience, as if neurons firing, hormones being exchanged, transmitters whizzing around the inside of your skull explain anything when it comes to consciousness. It can't even explain how the faintest flicker of everyday consciousness occurs, let alone the transformative consciousness of going to a place like paradise. And also, literary critics sometimes resort to performative understandings of words. So, this is the idea that, in a way, if you repeat what you're saying in fancy enough ways, then it becomes true as a kind of force of will. This is sometimes associated with social constructionism, the idea that we make our world, which is true in a way, but I think Dante would say we only make our world in relation to things as they actually are. This would be, in Christian terms, the notion of the incarnation, that life springs from not its own will, not its own resources, which it couldn't possibly do, but because it's a reflection, more or less keenly seen, accurately conveyed, of the divine life. As William Blake realised, if there weren't divine sources to all creativity, creativity itself would quickly fall into what he called the same dull round, dropping into ever decreasing circles until really there was nothing very creative about it, which you might wonder is a criticism for a lot of so-called creativity these days. No, Dante's very clear that his work is original in the original sense. It's about returning to the ever-present origin, and it's from that return that true originality and life springs. So he tells us this is true. In fact, it's about the truest thing that a human being could possibly try and convey. But he does so in a truthful way too, because this is not just about reporting what's happened. It's about trying to convey what's happened so that we too can share to some degree in what's happened, and so know its truthfulness in the way it resonates in us as well. This is why he describes the Divine Comedy as polysemantic. It does describe literal things, as it were, giving a surface report or account, but it does so also using allegory to help us make connections with other experiences that might open up the experience it's literally describing. Also, in the third way, tropologically, so that the very action of what he describes changes us so that we too can follow him in some way and so experience things not just allegorically but within our own selves. And then in the fourth way of polysemantic texts in the medieval period, it does so anagogically too. It ultimately conveys metaphors and leaves us on the point where we no longer just see things from our separate point of view, even happy to take Dante at his word, but also to feel things from the divine point of view, from the whole down. That is the ambition Dante has. You might say this isn't just another pilgrimage, like going to a famous well or Santiago de Compostela, valuable though that can be, a stopping place on the way to paradise. He's saying, no, follow me and we will go all the way to paradise, as I have indeed been. So let's use that fourfold schema, the literal, the allegorical, the tropological, and the anagogic, to ask more deeply how Dante tells us that the Divine Comedy is true. So the literal, first of all, he does say so many times throughout the poem itself. He repeatedly breaks the fourth wall, turning to us, his readers, and saying, I vow this is true on the work itself. Follow me if you can, and you must if you're to understand the truth of it. He says sometimes what I tell you might seem like a lie, but the very audacity of it maybe suggests to you that it's true. He says this when he meets Geryon, the fantastical monster of deceit and fraud that carries him and Virgil down into a deeper realm of hell. And then he just tells us straight up, invoking the name of God, no less, at the same time. So at the beginning of the paradise, he says, I'm now going to use all that I have, all that I can muster within my own talent to show you the glories of the divine talent. I have been into the highest heavens, and although it's my life's work to convey what that's like, I am going to do so. Here's what he says. The glory of the one who moves all things penetrates all the universe, reflecting in one part more and in another less. I have been in his brightest shining heaven and seen such things that no man once returned from there has wit or skill or to tell about. For when our intellect draws near its goal and fathoms to the depths of its desire, the memory is powerless to follow. But still, as much of heaven's holy realm as I could store and treasure in my mind shall now become the subject of my song. Dante also is very distinctive in the journey he conveys, and this lends the sense that it's really happened. So he repeatedly challenges our expectations, even tells us things which are really quite disturbing. So one challenge would be felt by contrasting the meeting with Francesca da Rimini in the Inferno and Cunizza in the Paradiso. You might think on the face of it that both Francesca and Cunizza have lived similar lives. They are lives that were driven by passion and lovemaking, and yet Francesca's in the Inferno and Cunizza is in paradise. Why is this so? That's the kind of challenge that Dante constantly puts to us. It's not an easy journey to understand. It has its distinctiveness, and it even has its disturbance. I mean, there is all that he undertakes in the Inferno, for example, which is gruesome and bloody and is hard to understand and make sense of. But even in the Paradise, disturbing things are said. St. Peter says to Dante that the Pope is doing nothing less than drinking Peter's own blood, the blood of his martyrdom. There can hardly be a stronger condemnation of the Church, which, if now feels shocking, in the medieval period certainly did So that distinctiveness, I think, is another really key component of Dante's literal veracity. And then he also tells us that he's made this journey in the famous letter to Can Grande of Verona. He describes how his journey is like that of St. Paul, who too made a journey into the third heaven, into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, he doesn't know. And so, by aligning himself with experiences that others have made too, he's saying, look, don't just take it on my word. The Apostle Paul says so. Maybe you know others who have made similar journeys, have had similar experiences. That's another way that he builds the literal case for his journey. So this leads to the second way that he conveys the truth of his journey to us, the allegorical, which involves telling us, not just as direct report, but by making links to other things that we might know. So, for example, he says that when he wakes in the dark wood midway through the course of our life, this is a shared experience right from the get-go, he talks about how it was his loves in life that were the thread that had almost broken but not quite, that began his journey. So this is in particular his love of Virgil and his love for Beatrice. They are the people that meet him at the beginning of his journey and just kindle enough light in the embers of his seemingly dying life to begin to step, well, first of all, into the darkness. And that's an important key for us. Remember, this is midway through the course of our life. When things seem to be shrouded in darkness, remember the things that you love, the things that bring warmth, and follow them. Right from the word go, Dante's indicating how this journey can be undertaken. And this light is worth following, this love is worth following, because it's not just kindled from within you. It's always already a response to divine life, to grace. It's already, as it were, not just you turning to Virgil and Beatrice, the equivalents for you and I, but the equivalents of Virgil and Beatrice meeting us as well. We're already immersed in a wider life that is seeking us, finding us, calling us. So developing that capacity is really important too, to make this journey. Listening, adjusting your sight, trusting that the works of the imagination aren't just empty fantasy, though they can be that, the conjurings of our own mind. They're actually threads that lead us towards the light. And of course, imagination is fundamental to this kind of journey as truth-bearing. Another way that he invites us to consider that this kind of journey is possible is in relation to things that were happening at his time that are still present to us now. So he lives in the generation or so after St. Francis. He lives in the generation of this great women's movement across Europe of the Beguines, which was stressing that everyday individuals, not just clergy, not just officially recognised saints, could experience the divine presence unalloyed, unmediated, as the women of the Beguines did, as Francis had shown. And it's pretty clear that Dante was particularly influenced by one Franciscan called Joachim of Flora, who stressed that we're now entering a new age, the end of the medieval period, the beginning of what we now call the modern period, you might say, where individuality becomes all the more important, not just the hierarchies of the earlier medieval period. And Joachim said that this is the age of the Spirit, and in the age of the Spirit will be poured out onto all people. And Dante is responding to that too. He puts Joachim in the heaven of the Son, even though Joachim himself had been condemned by the hierarchical church, perhaps unsurprisingly. And so he's saying a new thing's happening in the Divine Comedy, and that raises our expectations of what this newness might be. The fact that everyday people like Francis, like the Beguines, could journey to paradise. And then a third way that he tells us this happened is how he rewrites bits of Christian scripture, the Psalms in particular, prayers, as well as tells us that his own Divine Comedy is inspired. It can be read quite as in quite as many complex, nuanced, enriching ways as Scripture. This is a very bold thing to say, born of the confidence of someone who has been there, who feels the charge from heaven, no less, which he receives. So, for example, when he retells the Lord's Prayer in the Purgatory, he doesn't just repeat the Latin verses which every Christian would know, but introduces its own gloss. So, for example, he doesn't just say, "Thy will be done," as if God's will blasts across the cosmos and conforms all things to it. He says, "May our will conform to yours as the angels know in heaven." He's calling forth something from within us to ask about our will and ask how it aligns to the divine will. Not because the divine requires that, but because that's the way of entering divine life. When we become more aligned to the divine will, then life actually opens up for us, because the divine will wills life in all its fullness. That is what he's inviting us to do, to share in the divine life and stirring our desires within us. This perhaps takes us to the third way in which he conveys the truth, the tropological, because to know that divine life requires us to change. We are invited to participate in the divine life and have that participation stirred in us by reading the Divine Comedy. That's why Dante says the Divine Comedy can be likened to Scripture, these great works that actually change us in the reading of them. And participation is a key idea here, because it's not just knowledge of, he's not just reporting divine life or paradise as if it's a treatise. He's giving us a treatment of divine life and paradise that allows us to have knowledge from within these realms of reality, of experience, of awareness. So it's a very powerful form of participation, which we do all the time anyway. The modern world has its qualities which we participate in, and so tend to form and shape what we think of as true and false, how we experience things, what's excluded as well as what's included. The scientific world, mechanistic understandings of things do that. And Dante's inviting us to consider that if that's so unthinkingly, then by thinking and experience, reflecting on experience, can we participate more broadly in reality, extend that, rather than just assume that our age, our times have got it right when it comes to how to participate in reality. So he's inviting us to change as we read. It's a bit like riding a bike. You can read all you like about riding a bike, but it's not till you get on the bike that something really changes in your body, so you know how to do that, and as it were, a new part of experience opens up to you that just wasn't accessible before. It's revelatory to be able to ride a bike, take the stabilizers off. That's why it's such a joyful and delightful experience the first time it happens. Similarly with journeying into paradise. So another way of putting that is that this happens by developing certain qualities within ourselves, virtues, characteristics, habits of our personality. And the important thing about virtues is not just that they're about our behaviour, as if we have to somehow be good to get to heaven. No, virtues are important because they enable us to experience reality. They have epistemological benefits. They open up things to us. This is shown in one of the most intriguing experiences that Dante has actually in the Paradise, where he is before St. John in a very high realm, and John is asking him to talk about love. And he's doing so not because Dante must pass some kind of test, but because if Dante can celebrate love and show how this celebration comes from his heart, from his knowledge from within loving realms, then he can inhabit those loving realms all the more fully and share in the rejoicing of the loving realms. And Dante at first stumbles a bit. You don't expect it because he's already traversed so far. You think, what can possibly go wrong now? But he goes blind momentarily at this point in paradise. And I think what this is saying is that he's momentarily lost touch with that which is opening and expanding within him, and he takes a moment or two to recover. He says it wasn't an alarming blindness. He always knew that he was going to recover his sight. He was going to recover his capacity to be and exist in this high heaven. But it was also a moment where he had to adjust, and developing virtues by adjusting to reality, feeling how love, for example, enables you to reach out, but to reach out wisely, not just blindly, is a key part of developing the virtues. If you just say yes to everything willy-nilly, then you're likely to be overwhelmed. We must learn to say yes courageously, for sure, but also wisely, so we meet accurately, truthfully, that which we're seeking. And I think this encounter with John, when he momentarily goes blind, is conveying something of that adjustment that Dante was making, even in high parts of the paradise. It's often said that his mistake when he stands before John is that he's looking for evidence of a miracle. It was sometimes thought that John the Apostle was raised bodily into heaven, like Jesus at the Ascension, like Mary at the Assumption, and Dante wants to know whether this is true, and so stares at John, but we might say with kind of literal evidence-seeking eyes. And that is what causes him to go blind, because he's putting himself in a lower place of reality by demanding objective evidence as opposed to knowing subjectively the truth of where he is. This raises a really crucial point that I want to explore just by looking briefly at one of William Blake's images of the Divine Comedy here, the opening scene from the Inferno. And it's how we will see paradise and the Inferno and purgatory differently, because these are reflexive spaces. The truth of Dante's Divine Comedy doesn't mean that we would have the same journey if we underwent it. We would have one that spoke to us directly of divine life, and so in certain respects may be very different indeed. So, for example, one of the things which you notice with William Blake's image is that the dark wood that Dante finds himself in isn't actually dark. It actually looks like rather a beautiful, pleasing place. And this is Blake refusing Dante's much more powerful notion of original sin. As many commentators have noted, and as Yeats put it, Dante and Blake would be at spiritual enmity with one another. And there's a certain truth in that, but I think that the deeper truth is that as we align with reality, so reality shows up within us in different ways that nonetheless can also be seen to be reflections of a transcendent way. We're always taken to horizons. Blake shows his way of seeing things in different ways here as well. For example, you might notice that all the beasts look slightly like caricatures. Is Blake taking them as seriously as Dante does in the poem itself? He perhaps stresses this because he uses feet a lot in this image. So you'll notice that all the beasts have their left foot forward, which is this worldly material foot for Blake, whereas Dante has his right foot forward, which is the spiritual foot for Blake. Dante is already stepping into the spiritual reality that Blake felt is never eclipsed by the human condition. Precisely the opposite, the human condition opens it up. So the differences between different interpreters and illustrators of the Divine Comedy aren't contesting its truth. Precisely the opposite. They're showing how deeper truths must come to be known within us, not just delivered as if they're objective reports. Mirroring, I think, Dante's experience before John. It's the subjective where the essence, the heart of things are to be found, not the objective, in fact. So this is also to say that the right kind of consciousness is necessary to travel into paradise. And I think in particular, it's a consciousness that doesn't require exceptional experiences, peak experiences, you might say, but rather a steady, deepened knowledge of the presence of God. It's not actually a moment out of the ordinary, although certainly those exceptional experiences can invite us to contemplate how we might know what they reveal more steadily. Rather, it's about how all of us can meet all of the divine in our loving, for sure, in our desire, but in our knowledge, in our awareness, in the way that we become orientated, aligned to the divine life. So that's another change that has to happen, rather than paradise being maybe glimpsed on occasion or hoped for in the darkness. This is saying change so that it becomes a steady presence in your life, and that illumination, that radiance, that effulgence will gradually lighten up more and more of life. So it's done by following these little loves in life, the embers that can be kindled. It's done by participating in a knowledge that's direct rather than just read about or heard about, and bringing all that we are and expanding into this paradisal state of mind, which is to be then in paradise too. Dante is showing us this area of change that is really important. And then, fourthly, the anagogic. He conveys how the divine presence instills divine awareness within us. And this is perhaps most obviously displayed by the way the poem ends. It ends in a kind of silence. Dante says, "My words are breaking down." And as you read particularly the last canto, you feel the divine presence coming more and more through the words, around the words, the cracks that let the light in. And that silence is really important. Remember, he'd said in the letter to Can Grande that he's going into realms where memory breaks down, although he's going to use all he can to muster echoes and reflections of what he knew then. And the thing about memory is that it's in the past, and so requires us to reach back to an experience and try and drag it into the presence to convey it. Whereas Dante's saying that the anagogic point of view is all presence. It's in an eternal present. And so what his poem must do, particularly at the end, is bring us into the present presence of the divine, and then we can know what he is talking about. It even requires language to cease, because language inevitably uses subjects and objects. It divides reality up in order to speak, and what he wants to convey is the felt quality of the presence that doesn't divide reality up. And that's another reason why language must fall into this fecund, rich silence. He, of course, uses many metaphors to convey this, to take us to right to the edge of this presence. One that's particularly powerful in the last canto refers to when the god Neptune looked up from the depths of the Black Sea and saw the Argo, the ship built by Jason, travelling the waters overhead for Neptune, and didn't know what he was seeing, because the Argo is said to be the first ship, and that requires a shift of consciousness to build a ship. It's not just about know-how and technology, it's about the imagination to think, to travel across the waters, to want to discover and step over the horizon. And it was such a surprise to Neptune, even though Neptune's a god, that Dante says Neptune wrestled for many centuries trying to remember what he'd seen in order to bring it into his presence, and so understand, comprehend fully this invention of the ship. This is one metaphor amongst a whole load that Dante uses to take us to the edge, which is actually the beginning of all fullness, where he has been too. And then there's the business of poetry itself. You know, poetry, trying to find the right words, the right images, is polysemantic as well. But in this fourth anagogic stage, I think Dante is using also to remake himself. You might say it has a tantric quality, as he seeks for that which can stir within him the memory for sure, but also bring back to his present the presence of the divine that he knew. He's remaking himself so that this consciousness can fill the rest of his mortal life on earth. He now actively calls on the divine around him, on the muses, on the saints. He doesn't just feel lost in the woods as he did at the beginning and is glad to see Virgil appear. He can much more actively engage and participate with reality as he makes these invocations, and that leads him to write the amazing verse, to come up with the neologisms as well. I mean, never underestimate how hard it is to come up with a new words that really sticks. Remember that Dante makes modern Italian, and language is a living thing. someone can't do that by force of will. They do that because the language they use resonates with reality, and so resonates in other people's hearts and minds, and so becomes the way that they want to speak as well. The fact that Dante is the father of modern Italian is, I think, more evidence that he really has gone to paradise, which is also to say that the Divine Comedy speaks to people still. It is inspired, it channels, it transmits. It's not a text that as an individual you read once and then think you've got it. When you get into it, you want to return to it time and time again as it yields up more. And 700 years on, it's still speaking to people as well. It can seem a bold claim of Dante's to have said that this is an inspired text, like a scripture that can convey the divine presence. But it's a bold one that has proven to be right. This is the test of the veracity of true imagination, as Coleridge described it, that it lasts. Mere fantasy, he said, can amuse us, but it bores us if we return to it more than, say, 2 or 3 times. But that which is true of the imagination constantly yields up newness, and that's because when we return to it again and again, the divine newness, the divine imagination speaks through it, and so leads us to feel this expansive, soulful, desirous, aware, knowledgeable consciousness of the divine. It's no small part of the truth of the Divine Comedy and the veracity of Dante's claim that he actually went to paradise and wants to convey that happiness to us now, that we can still turn to it now and receive that light which began to burn when he stepped into the dark wood.